The dust of Red Mesa behaved like a living thing, creeping into windowsills, clinging to boots, coating the walls of the general store, and settling thick in the creases of judgment that shaped the town's collective face. It drifted in slow spirals behind Ulleia Harper as she walked, the two wooden water buckets bumping against her full hips with every step she took toward the river. She carried herself with the rigid dignity of a woman who had learned long ago that posture was sometimes the last defense a person could control. The townspeople stared as she passed, their eyes sharp as barbed wire and twice as cold. Mothers pulled their children close. Old folks muttered prayers. Everyone else pretended not to look while very clearly looking. She did not flinch. She did not hurry. She only walked. Ulleia's dark curls hung heavy down her back despite the sun's relentless attention, and her plus-sized frame moved with a quiet confidence that irritated the people who had tried so hard to strip her of it. To them, she was the devil widow, a woman whose very presence caused crops to fail and men to lose their senses. And two dead husbands, both buried in tidy rows on the hill above town, made for convenient evidence. The truth, however, was nothing like the myth. But myth was easier for most folks to swallow than responsibility. The well in the town square was close to her cabin, clean and generously deep, yet its crank had not turned for her since the day Samuel Harper's coffin touched Red Mesa soil. The townspeople refused her access, whispering that the water would spoil if she drew from it. So she walked the long road to the river every morning, carrying the buckets that bruised her thighs and shoulders. She had decided long ago that indignity was better than begging. When she reached the riverbank, she knelt on the smooth stones, her skirt brushing the water's edge. Her reflection rippled. Dark eyes, high cheekbones, curves that the desert sun could not diminish, and the faint tension at the corners of her mouth that grief had carved and rumor had deepened. 2 husbands dead, 2 tragedies twisted into accusations she had not earned. She lowered the first bucket into the cool water. Then she heard hoofbeats. A shadow swallowed her reflection. She looked up slowly, bracing for another confrontation, another threat, another reminder from some self-righteous man about how she was cursed. Instead, she saw a rider who seemed too large for the horse beneath him. The man sat the animal easily, though he could have outweighed it. His long coat settled like a blanket of dusk over his shoulders, and the brim of his hat cast his face in darkness. Bartholomew Radcliffe, called Bear by strangers and friends alike, had arrived in Red Mesa just hours earlier. Word of him had spread faster than smoke in a dry wind, giant, quiet, dangerous if crossed. Men stepped aside when he passed, not because they feared violence, but because something in his calm suggested he had survived worse than any of them could imagine. He had been given a room with a broken door and a cracked window, charged double for it, and had paid without protest. A man used to poor treatment did not waste his breath complaining. He climbed down from his horse with the deliberate slowness of someone who knew that sudden movements made people nervous. His boots thudded lightly against the earth, dust curled around them. Ulleia rose halfway, unsure whether to greet him or prepare for hostility. The wind caught her skirt and pressed it lightly against her legs. Bear took off his hat. The gesture startled her. Respect was a rare courtesy in Red Mesa. "Ma'am, I hear tell you might be needin' help. Repairs at your place. I swear I'll be gentle with your property." For a moment she only stared. A giant of a man, offering gentleness. The promise sat between them, soft but solid. "I don't need charity," she replied, her voice measured. "Good," he said with a slow nod. "I wasn't offering charity, just help. Porch won't fix itself." A faint sound escaped her, almost a laugh, almost a sigh. She dipped the second bucket into the water. Bear watched her hands, her steady movements, her refusal to tremble. But the river's quiet did not last. Hoofbeats sounded again, multiple riders, the kind of organized rhythm that spelled trouble before the riders even appeared. Ulleia stiffened. Bear straightened, turning slightly so that his body shielded her without touching her or crowding her. Hiram Bastwick and his men rode up the bank like a storm of dust and contempt. Hiram's horse pranced beneath him as if even the animal resented its rider. His eyes narrowed at Bear, then flicked to Ulleia with disgust. "Stranger, you picked poor company for conversation." Bear didn't move toward his gun. He didn't have to. His presence alone made most men hesitate. "Seems company pleasant enough to me," he said calmly. Hiram snorted. "That woman brings misfortune. Her husband's died in her shadow. Crops rot where she walks. Children take sick when she passes." Ulleia's spine stiffened, but she did not speak. Bear picked up one of her buckets. The handle nearly vanished in his hand. "Seems a lot of blame for one person," he murmured. "That's facts," Hiram snapped. Bear lifted the second bucket and nodded toward the cabin. "Ma'am, shall we head back?" They walked away from Hiram's men side by side. Neither looked back. Neither needed to. And for the first time in a long while, Ulleia Harper felt the smallest flicker of something she thought she had forgotten. Hope.
By morning, Red Mesa buzzed with whispers sharp enough to cut skin. The giant stranger was seen near the Devil Widow's cabin, people said, seen at her river, seen walking beside her with her bucket swinging from his hands as though he'd been born to carry burdens she had long carried alone. Rumor traveled like wildfire through dry wheat, consuming facts in its spread. Bartholomew Radcliffe, Bear, seemed entirely unbothered by the mutterings. He had eaten a thin breakfast at the saloon while conversations around him quieted, then shifted to louder registers the moment he rose from his seat. Men pretended to not watch him leave, but their eyes tracked him through the dust like vultures following movement. When he reached Ulleia's cabin, the sun was still stretching over the horizon. He wore no coat, only a work shirt rolled at the sleeves. A satchel of tulle hung from his shoulder. The porch boards, warped and loosened by years of neglect and the town's willful refusal to trade with Ulleia, creaked beneath his feet. "These'll need replacing," he murmured, examining the wood grain with a careful hand. To Bear, every broken board told a story, of weather, of time, of neglect, of someone forced to repair what others had deliberately ruined. Ulleia watched him from behind the half-open door. Her plus-size frame remained still, except for the way her fingers flexed against the apron she wore. She wasn't one to trust easily. She'd had trust beaten out of her by circumstances, and sharpened again by necessity. But there was something disarming about Bear's quiet competence, the way his strength moved without arrogance. Even his presence on her porch felt like an unfamiliar luxury. "You don't need to do this," she said softly. "Porch ain't gonna fix itself," Bear replied without looking up. His voice carried an easy certainty, not coaxing her, not flattering her, just stating a quiet truth. The rhythm of his work soon filled the air, nails tapped into place with precision, wood shifting under pressure, footsteps measured but never heavy. Bear moved like someone who understood how much damage strength could do and took care never to inflict it by accident. By noon, the town had taken notice. They watched from a distance. The blacksmith leaning too long against the forge, the preacher strolling by 3 times with his Bible unopened, the doctor's wife with her bonnet tipped a little too high to hide her curiosity. None of them came close, but all of them watched. The giant cowboy's presence beside Ulleia was a disruption of the stories they had built around her, and people hated having to rewrite stories. Ulleia stepped onto the porch briefly, setting a glass of water on the rail for Bear. "They're watching," she murmured. "Let 'em." His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "People watch what they don't understand. Sometimes they're waiting to see a spell. Sometimes they're waiting to see the truth." Ulleia's eyes softened, just a flicker. "They think you're under one." "Spell?" Bear raised a brow, testing the newly placed board with his boot. "What kind would that be?" "The kind that makes men do foolish things." He straightened, finally meeting her gaze. "Nothing foolish about treating someone decent."
The words settled in her chest like warm sand. The moment was interrupted by footsteps on the path. The general store owner approached with the careful gait of a man carrying news he hoped would sting. "Ma'am? Sir?" He stopped 3 paces from the porch, close enough to be heard, far enough to keep distance. "Folks in town are getting concerned about the situation here." "What situation is that?" Bear asked without pausing his work. "The, natural order of things?" The store owner gulped. "Some think consequences are coming." Ulleia stiffened. Those words had always preceded danger. Bear set down his hammer. "Town seems to run on fear and gossip, far as I can tell." "We're good Christian people," the store owner insisted. "And yet," Bear said mildly, "you leave a woman to haul water half a mile because you're scared she'll spoil the well." The man flushed scarlet. He retreated with muttered excuses, nearly tripping over himself in the haste to flee. Bear resumed working. Ulleia, standing in the doorway, let herself breathe again. But the air was too still, too expectant. Then she smelled it. Smoke, a faint acrid thread drifting in from the back of her property. Bear caught it at nearly the same moment. He walked to the edge of the porch and narrowed his eyes toward the ridge. 3 riders sat their horses there, deliberately, brazenly. One held a burning torch. Flames licked upward from the massive brush pile behind her garden. Ulleia's breath caught. "That's the pile I meant to clear. The wind, Bear, it'll drive the flames straight to the cabin." "How long's it been there?" he asked, while already assessing the direction of the smoke. 2 months, since the old oak blew down." Bear didn't lose a second. "Get your important papers, anything you can't replace." She ran inside. Minutes later, town people emerged onto the ridge path, drawn by the smoke like moths to disaster. Some brought buckets, others came empty-handed, but full of anticipation. A few wore smiles they didn't bother hiding. Bear reached the fire first. Flames roared up the brush pile, already spreading into the dry grass. Behind him, Ulleia clutched a wooden box to her chest. "The fire's spreading," Bear called out to the watching crowd. "Gonna need help." The saloon-keeper snorted. "Maybe the curse'll burn itself out." Bear ignored him. His focus shifted to the blacksmith, whose broad shoulders were tight with hesitation and shame. "Could use a strong back," he said quietly. The man wavered. Then he moved forward. That was all it took. The doctor's wife followed. The baker. A handful of children with blankets. Not everyone, but enough. Bear organized them like he'd been commanding fire lines his whole life. Water throwers, dirt carriers, blanket beaters. Ulleia worked where she knew best. Her land, her wind, her patterns. She called out warnings, spotted flare points, directed shovelers with the confidence of someone who'd long practiced being ignored, but no longer was. And slowly, sweat-soaked, smoke-stung, the flames died. When it was done, the town stared at Ulleia differently. Not with fear, with recognition, with guilt, with something new forming behind their eyes. The beginnings of respect. The saloon-keeper scowled and walked away. Wyro's men watched from afar. Their plan burned down to ash. Bear walked back to Ulleia's side, soot on his face, gentleness in his voice. "They won't stop," she whispered. "I don't intend to either," he replied. And for the second time since meeting him, hope stirred in her chest.
3 days after the fire, Red Mesa lived in the strange quiet that follows a crisis. An uneasy calm where people behaved politely out of temporary guilt and gossip moved with softer footsteps than usual. But beneath that hush lay tension, coiled and waiting. Hiram Bastwick had ridden past Ulleia's property twice that morning. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't needed to. His presence alone was a warning. Inside Ulleia Harper's cabin, Bear sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by papers. The room smelled faintly of desert sage and ink, and the soft scratch of quill marks had filled the last 2 hours. Her handwriting was narrow and precise, the sort of script taught by strict school teachers and sharpened by a mind that never let details slip. Bear's large hands dwarfed her pages as he turned them over. "You cataloged everything?" he asked. "Everything they blamed on me," she answered. She stood by the stove, stirring coffee she no longer tasted. Dates, times, witnesses, weather, injuries, who benefited, who didn't. My father taught me never to fight rumors with emotion. Fight them with structure. Her voice held no pride, only weary discipline. Bear studied her work. The pages formed a lattice of grief and logic. Samuel Harper's rattlesnake bite, Thomas's supposed riding accident, the tax assessor's heart attack, the bank examiner's weak heart. Every line pointed to the same man. Hiram Bastwick had cultivated her reputation as a curse so he could move unseen behind it. "You've been doing this alone," Bear murmured. "Who would believe the devil widow?" she said quietly. Before he could respond, a knock sounded on the door, rapid, nervous. Bear rose instantly, instinct sharpened by years of towns with dangerous men and easily bought sheriffs. He positioned himself where he could open the door while still shielding Ulleia from sight. When he pulled it open, Dr. Marcus Webb stood on the porch, sweat beading at his temples though morning was still cool. He clutched his medical bag against his chest like a shield. I need to speak with both of you," he whispered, eyes darting toward the road. "About the deaths." Ulleia opened the door wider. "Come in." The doctor crossed the threshold quickly, as though the ground outside might swallow him if he lingered. Inside, he set his medical bag on the table but didn't open it. Instead, he removed a worn leather journal from his coat. His fingers trembled as he placed it beside Ulleia's papers. Bear studied him. Fear rolled off the man like heat from a forge, but beneath it was something more potent: guilt. "I kept 2 sets of records," Dr. Webb said quietly, "the official reports and the truth." He flipped open the journal. Pages filled with delicate sketches, pulse readings, wound examinations, and private annotations spilled across the table. "Samuel Harper," the doctor said, voice cracking. "He wasn't dead when they brought him to me. The venom was slow. I could have saved him." Ulleia froze, her hand tightening on the back of her chair. "Hiram was there," Dr. Webb continued. "He dismissed my assistant, told me Sam was already gone, ordered me to pronounce him dead. He swallowed thickly. He threatened to ruin my practice if I refused." "And Thomas?" Ulleia whispered. The doctor turned several pages. "The wound on his skull, too clean, too focused. Rocks don't leave patterns like that." He pointed to a drawing he had made the night of the examination. Someone struck him with a rounded object, hard, with intent. Ulleia lowered her gaze. Her breath shuddered, but she did not cry. She had long suspected murder. Suspicion was bitter, but survivable. Hearing confirmation was something else, grief sharpened into certainty. Bear's jaw clenched. He leaned closer. "Why now? Why come forward after all this time?" "The fire," the doctor whispered. "Watching the town help her, watching her save their homes, I realized I'd been hiding behind fear while Hiram used her as a shield. And I can't—" His voice cracked. "I'm a physician. I swore an oath, but I've been helping to bury truth." Ulleia met his eyes. "You're risking everything by coming here." "I've already lost everything that mattered. This is the only way to get it back." Bear looked between them. Ulleia's ledger, the doctor's journal, the intersecting evidence. "We need more than records. We need a judge." "Judge Morrison," Ulleia said thoughtfully. "He comes through once a quarter." "Next month," Dr. Webb added. "But Hiram watches the telegraph office. If we warn the judge, Hiram will know." Bear nodded slowly. "Then we make the judge come for something he can't ignore." Ulleia understood instantly. "A formal petition." Dr. Webb blinked. "A complaint big enough that he has to investigate. Multiple signatures. Town can't pretend ignorance if enough voices speak at once." Ulleia's eyes narrowed with determination. "But people are afraid. They won't sign unless they know their voices will be protected. And they will be. We'll gather statements privately, quietly, then send a rider Hiram ain't watching. Dr. Webb nodded. I can give sworn testimony. And I can provide the structure, Ulleia said. Dates, patterns, motives. Bear looked at both of them. The weight of the task was enormous, the risk even greater. But they had something Hiram never expected them to wield: truth. For the next hours, they spread every document across the table. Ulleia's careful handwriting aligned with Dr. Webb's meticulous notes. Bear helped organize witness lists, suggested the names of those with guilty consciences or quiet loyalties, and laid out a path through the town's hidden fears. The evidence formed a single, damning story. When they were done, when the sun dipped low and shadows crawled up the cabin walls, Bear closed the last ledger gently. This ain't just a case anymore. It's a reckoning. Ulleia held his gaze. Then we fight it together. And for the first time in years, maybe ever, she did not feel alone.
The petition began as a whisper, a folded sheet tucked beneath a blacksmith's anvil, a quiet conversation behind the bakery, a subtle nod exchanged in the alley behind the general store. Red Mesa had lived in the grip of Hiram Bastwick's shadow for so long that the idea of speaking against him seemed like touching a hot iron, dangerous, foolish, certain to leave scars. But the fire at Ulleia's cabin had shown the town something Hiram had not intended: the difference between a rumor and a real threat. And the real threat had not been Ulleia. Bear walked the town with patient precision, moving as a man who understood human behavior better than human weapons. He approached people not with pressure, but with quiet truth. "Ain't asking you to be brave," he told them, "just asking you to be honest." Some refused outright. Some couldn't meet his eyes. But others, guilty men, ashamed women, people who had seen too much, found themselves unable to lie to a man who never raised his voice. Ulleia worked from her cabin, pen sweeping across parchment in elegant, measured strokes. She drafted affidavits, structured statements, matched witness accounts with her own ledger of dates and patterns. Her notes became the skeleton of a case strong enough to withstand Hiram's political influence. Dr. Webb carefully copied his medical findings into a cleaner, more formal record. Each entry was a confession in ink: falsification of death certificate, cause of death inconsistent with accident, evidence of pressure to report false findings. Every word he wrote was a piece of himself he was laying bare. By the time the petition was complete, it held 27 signatures. Not enough to start a war, enough to force the law to look. At dawn on the fourth day, Bear handed the final sealed envelope to a traveling merchant heading west, a man who owed nothing to Hiram and everything to coin. "Ride fast," he told him. "Don't stop unless your horse does." The merchant grinned. "If the judge's coin is good, I'll ride faster." Tension hummed through Red Mesa like a bowstring pulled taut. People lingered on porches. Conversations died when strangers approached. Lamps glowed late in windows, outlining silhouettes pacing back and forth. Hiram Bastwick rode through town with his men, slow and predatory. Their horses clacked on the boards of the main street, iron shoes echoing against the clapboard walls. People watched from behind curtains. No one stepped outside. Ulleia peered through her window as the riders passed. Bear stood beside her, arms crossed. His presence filled the small room, and the air around him felt steadier, anchored. "He knows something's coming," she murmured. "Let him know it. Fear makes men sloppy." Dr. Webb arrived after sunset, shoulders hunched, journal clutched beneath his coat. "The mayor's called a meeting tomorrow night," he said breathlessly. "Says the town must reassert order." Bear exchanged a look with Ulleia. They both understood what that meant. Hiram was preparing to retake control. But not for long.
The next evening, the community hall overflowed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, pressed against windows, crowded onto benches. The air buzzed with anticipation and dread. The mayor fumbled with his notes, glancing toward the door every few seconds. Hiram Bastwick strode in late, his spurs clicking, his posture confident despite the tension. His men fanned out behind him like a living wall. Then the doors at the back swung open again. Judge Morrison entered, flanked by 2 federal marshals. A gasp rippled through the hall. Hiram froze. His eyes widened before his expression hardened into a brittle calm. "Judge Morrison," the mayor squeaked. We weren't expecting." The judge held up a hand. "I received a formal petition detailing allegations of corruption, fraud, intimidation, and murder." His gaze swept the room. "This community meeting is now a legal inquiry." Bear and Ulleia sat at the front table beside Dr. Webb. Hiram's stare landed on them with violent intent, but the marshal's presence held him at bay. "Proceed," Judge Morrison instructed. Ulleia rose first. Her posture was steady, her voice clear. She presented the timelines, the patterns, the suspicious coincidences that aligned too perfectly to be fate. Every word dismantled a rumor the town had clung to like a shield. Next came Dr. Webb. The crowd leaned forward as he opened his leather journal. He described the falsified reports, the injuries that did not match accidents, the venom that could have been treated, the wounds inflicted by human hands rather than nature. The howl murmured. People exchanged glances, fear, shame, washing through them like a slow tide. Hiram attempted to interrupt. "This is madness, lies from a cursed woman and a cowardly doctor." The judge silenced him with a glare. Then the telegraph operator stood. He carried a crumpled pile of copied messages. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I kept copies of telegraphs Mr. Bastwick ordered destroyed, messages arrangements to eliminate certain folks." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, tears. Bear remained seated, calm as a still lake. He met Hiram's gaze without blinking. Hiram's confidence broke beneath that quiet steadiness. Finally, the judge stood. "I have heard enough." He faced Hiram. "You are under arrest for murder, conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice." The marshals moved in. Hiram's men stepped back, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Their allegiance had always been to survival, not to him. As they shackled Hiram's wrists, he spat toward Ulleia. "This isn't over. People like you don't win." Ulleia's voice was calm as stone. "People like me survive. People like you get judged." As Hiram was taken through the doorway, the crowd shifted. Some cried. Some apologized. Some simply stared at Ulleia as though seeing her for the first time. Bear rose, placing a steadying hand on the back of her chair. The gesture was subtle, protective, without possession. The judge addressed the crowd. "Red Mesa will rebuild its truth from this day forward." And in that moment, the town's story began to change.
In the weeks following Hiram Bastwick's arrest, Red Mesa moved like a creature stirring from a long sleep, slow, cautious, blinking against sudden sunlight. The fear that had once shaped every corner of the town began to loosen, drifting off like smoke from a dying fire. People spoke more softly, not from suspicion, but from the adjustment of newly freed lungs. Doors stayed open longer. Neighbors paused on porches instead of hiding behind shutters. Kindness became something people practiced, halting and uneven, but practiced all the same. Ulleia Harper noticed the changes one small gesture at a time. The blacksmith's wife brought fresh bread every Friday morning, shyly placing it on the porch rail before hurrying away. The doctor's wife visited with packets of wildflower seeds to help restore Ulleia's fire-scorched garden.
The baker offered coffee beans as thanks for what you'd done for the town, though she insisted she had done nothing but survive. Even the preacher, stiff-backed and cautious, tipped his hat on Sundays. It was not absolution, it was acknowledgement, and that alone eased something in Ulleia's chest that had been tight for years. Bear noticed the change too, though he spoke of it sparingly. He had accepted the position of sheriff without ceremony. The badge hung on his coat like it had belonged there all along. His presence settled over Red Mesa like a protective wind, never harsh, always steady, the sort of watchfulness that made rowdy drunks think twice and gossipers hold their tongues. He patrolled at unhurried intervals, stopping by the blacksmith's forge, the doctor's office, the schoolyard. He rarely raised his voice, and he never needed to raise a weapon. People listened because Bear treated them as though they mattered, and most had forgotten what that felt like. As for Ulleia, her cabin had become a quiet center of learning. She reopened her books, law, mathematics, literature, and found joy in sharing knowledge again. Children visited in the afternoons to practice reading. A few grown men came by sheepishly after dark to ask about land deeds or contracts they didn't understand. Ulleia guided them patiently, grateful to use skills she had long kept buried. One evening she stood in her garden, her skirts brushing against fresh sprouts the doctor's wife had helped her plant. The sun slanted low across the mesa, painting the sky in bold oranges and rose-colored streaks. The warm air smelled of new blossoms and distant rain. Bear appeared at the fence, leaning one arm across the top rail. He carried his hat in the other hand, his hair ruffled from a long day in the heat. "Garden's coming along," he said softly. "It'll be a while before it's full again, but it's a start." Bear's eyes moved over the rows of soil, the tiny blooms, the scorched patches still healing. "Town's like that too," he said. "You think it'll heal fully?" "It will if folks keep tending it. Every place needs caretakers, gardens, towns, people." She looked down at her hands, hands once accused of bringing death, now coaxing life from earth. Bear's words settled into her like a seed taking root. "Walk with me," he said gently. She wiped her palms on her apron and joined him on the path toward the cabin. They walked side by side, neither speaking at first. Bear's long stride slowed to match hers, and she felt something in the silence that wasn't awkward, but familiar, like two melodies settling into harmony. "You ever think about leaving, now that the danger's past? You've seen worse places. You could find somewhere quieter." Bear smiled, small and real. "I ain't looking for quiet. I'm looking for honest. This town's finally starting to be that." "And you? You plan on teaching forever from that little cabin?" She laughed softly. "If they keep coming, I'll keep teaching. Knowledge should never be wasted." She paused. "Do you think they'll always look at me differently now?" "They already do. Not the way they used to. They see the woman who saved their homes, the woman who helped bring justice." He nudged her elbow lightly. "They see you, Ulleia, not the story they told themselves." Her breath caught at the earnestness in his voice. She stopped walking and faced him fully. "And what do you see?" Bear's gaze traveled from her eyes to her hands, then back again with a tenderness that felt as steady as his voice. "I see the strongest woman I've met. Smart, steady, brave as hell, and someone I'd like to keep walking beside, if she'll let me." Ulleia felt warmth bloom through her chest, not the burning hurt of rumor, but a gentle unfolding. "I'd like that," she said quietly. They resumed walking toward the porch. The boards beneath their feet, replaced by Bear's steady hand, held firm and unyielding. Ulleia brushed her fingers along the railing, feeling the smooth polish of the wood. "Town's talking," Bear said after a moment, "but this time talk is good. Folks want you on the school board. Some want you advising the council." She shook her head with a smile. "Imagine that. the devil widow helping run the town. You ain't been that for a long time, if ever, Bear replied. The sky deepened, stars beginning to prick through the fading light. Bear leaned one shoulder against the porch post, watching her with the same steady look he'd given her the day they met at the river. I made your promise back when folks tried scaring me off. You did, she whispered. I said I'd be gentle. His eyes warmed. That promise still stands. Not out of pity, out of respect. I don't want a gentleman because I'm fragile. I want one because he chooses gentleness even when the world expects force. Bear nodded, understanding her perfectly. He reached out, slowly, giving her time to step back if she wished. She didn't. His hand brushed hers, lightly, warm and steady. For the first time in years, Ulleia Harper felt entirely seen. The town that once shunned her now stood on the cusp of transformation, and at the edge of her newly rebuilt porch, beneath a sky blooming with stars, Ulleia and Bear, two souls tempered by hardship, began shaping a future defined not by fear, but by the gentleness they had both fought so hard to preserve.